neurologist too. I'm totally unbiased here. Welcome with a very warm applause, please, James Cooke.
I'm going to get pretty grandiose actually about the brain in this anyway, so you kind of stole my thunder, but please try not to vomit when I go on about how great our field is, but it is. Other direction. Cool. So yeah, I'm a neuroscientist, and I'm in the neuroscience game because I want to understand the cortex. So whenever you've seen a picture of the brain, like this one, you usually be looking at cortex. It's this kind of wrinkly outer surface. That probably looks quite familiar. But underneath, there are lots of other complicated structures like the hypothalamus that we heard about earlier. And we share these structures with reptiles, and they take care of basic kind of survival things like sleeping and breathing, eating, that kind of stuff. But in mammals, the cortex sits on top, and the cortex doesn't bother itself with kind of keeping us alive. It takes care of more interesting stuff like perception, language, decision-making, the kind of stuff we think of as making us human. So these different functions tend to be localized to different areas of the brain, and it's kind of color-coded here. But the really cool thing about the cortex is no matter what function it's performing, whether it's decision-making or vision or movement or whatever, it's all kind of the same stuff. So those areas underneath that I showed you, they have really complicated circuits that do very specific functions. But the cortex is all cortex, and it seems it can basically do anything. If you plug in eyes to it, it lets you see. If you plug in a mouth, it lets you speak. So this is just a picture of the brain with a bit scooped out. So you can see that the cortex is, we don't do that in human brains. You can see the cortex is just a single folded sheet. So it's about that big. If you flatten it out, again, we don't do that. So in early mammals, it was really tiny, smooth cortex, just like a little cap on top of these other areas. But it's expanded so much in evolution that now it's about 1,000 times the size of a mouse's cortex. And that's why it's folded. So we evolved these big skulls to fit it all in, and then even then, evolution wanted more, so it crammed in as much as possible by folding it up so that it get as much surface area as possible. That's kind of a clue to its importance, which I'll come back to later. If you look at it under a microscope, you can see that it's basically made up of this single repeating module that we call a cortical column. And again, whether there's vision, hearing, decision-making, it all looks like this. It's the same thing. Same cells wired up in the same way. So this is basically the structure that I want to understand. And if we can understand this, in one go, we'll kind of understand all these different functions that make us human. So yeah, there are lots of other reasons as well that we want to understand the cortex. So as I said, it is expanded massively in evolution. You can see from like a rat to a cat and then human, how much it kind of gets bigger and wrinklier. And this doesn't come free. So having a bigger brain means that you have to have a bigger skull, and that increases the chance of dying during childbirth. And even then, having such a big brain means that our brain uses about 20% of all of the energy consumption of our body, and that's a massive price to pay in evolutionary terms, so it must be really important. So secondly, right now your cortex is doing something that we have no idea how to make even the biggest supercomputers in the world do it. You're effortlessly picking the meaning out of my words. And this supercomputer runs on basically the output, power consumption of an entire output, words muddled, the entire output of a power station to power one of these things, whereas your brain does all that on the power of the same energy consumption as a light bulb. So if we can figure out what it is in the cortex that allows it to be such a powerful computer, we'll be able to build computers that can work like your brain, and we'll essentially have artificial intelligence. And also, lots of mental illness stems from the cortex. So this is Stephen Wiltshire. He's an autistic savant, and he draws these amazing cityscapes from memory. And like, if you show him, a skyscraper once, he'll be able to reproduce it perfectly with exactly the right number of windows. But as well as having this amazing talent, he also struggles with things that most people find really trivial, like basic communication, as a result of his autism. So autism is known to arise because of changes in the cortex. So if we can understand the cortex, we should be able to develop some better cures for things like autism. And the same is true for schizophrenia. So this is an artist in Victorian England called Louis Wain, and he was the foremost painter of anthropomorphic cats, which is a good thing to be. But as well as painting cats, he had schizophrenia, unfortunately, and had these recurring episodes that got worse and worse throughout his life. And you can see how his changing view of the world is reflected in his art. So these are all cats, and these were painted in Victorian England. And these are like this because his cortex has changed very slightly. And we heard earlier that there are sleep disruptions as well, interactions, but the prefrontal cortex, the bit in humans that has most recently evolved, that's the main bit that's disrupted in schizophrenia, and that produces things like this. And so if we can understand the cortex, we can go a long way to hopefully come up with cures for things like schizophrenia, which is really important because, as well as creating cool art, he would have suffered from horrible, hallucinations and really horrible things. So, also, the same is true with Alzheimer's. So on the left, there's a healthy brain, on the right, there's a brain of an Alzheimer's patient. And essentially in Alzheimer's, you just lose cells in your cortex, which is why it looks kind of thinned and shriveled here. So if we can understand how it is that physical connections between physical cells in your cortex right now, that's storing memories and meaning, and somehow if you lose those cells, you lose your mind, you lose memory and meaning. If we can understand how that happens in the cortex, we'll hopefully be able to be pointed in the right direction for cures for things like Alzheimer's. So what's the hold up? Are we just really lazy and we just haven't bothered figuring out this cortex yet? Well, the main problem is all the cells are just jumbled together. There's pretty much been no way to pick them apart and figure out how this machine is wired up. Until recently, when we can now kind of look at and target different cells based on different genes they express, and now finally we can tell them apart and separate them out, and we can figure out how they're wired together and how this machine works. Not only that, a really amazing development in the last 10 years is a new tool called optogenetics. So essentially what some really especially clever neuroscientists figured out how to do is to trick viruses to install genetically encoded solar panels onto a single type of brain cell. So then we can turn on and off individual brain cells with light. So we now have a remote control to control the brain, send messages into it without going anywhere near it. So we can use that to, again, figure out how this cortical column is wired up and figure out how it works. So what do? You can't study the whole cortex at once, so I focus on the auditory part, being a jazz musician as well, as mentioned earlier. And that's the blue part you can see here, conveniently located by your ears. And all mammals have it. And it's the bit of your brain that you're using right now to hear me. So what do, I take an electrode, which has dozens of metal contacts on it, I insert it into a single cortical column in a mouse brain, and then I can turn on and off individual cells with light. So then the aim of that is to understand how sound is processed here, with the aim to figuring out if there are general principles that apply as much to sound processing as to decision making. So now that we have all these amazing new tools, the stage is set for us to finally understand this amazing structure. And if we can, we'll be placed to cure mental illness, create artificial intelligence, and understand what it is that makes us human. So it really is an exciting time to be starting out in neuroscience. Thanks a lot.